in Arabic. That's not there for you to read, because for the most part it's unreadable. It's there because if it weren't there, it could not be called the Quran. Translating the Quran from the language in which it was revealed, the language in which God revealed it, makes it no longer the Quran. That's what we're talking about when we say the power of the word. A power reflected, of course, not just in calligraphy, but also in the various traditions that arise out of Islam, whether we're talking about the tradition of the ghazal, the tradition of the qawwal, the tradition of dhikr itself, the Sufi tradition of dhikr. What does dhikr mean? It means remembrance, the remembrance of God. And that remembrance comes precisely from the barakah that is absorbed in the Quran. Now, this is the history of the power of the word. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that throughout modern history, and indeed even over the last 6 months, as we have seen an entirely new Middle East slowly arise from the stilted, despotic regimes that have oppressed the people of that region for the last 50, 60 years. And it shouldn't be a surprise that out of that, part of the reason, part of the impetus for that new Middle East is, again, the word, poetry in particular. The collection that I've put together in this book is mostly it's not mostly, it is from the 20th century. It goes from 1910 to 2010. It's translated from Arabic, from Persian, Urdu, and Turkish. But one of the things that you discover when you read this book is the way in which poetry and in which fiction, just the word in general, literature in general, gave shape to what we now refer to as the modern Middle East. The great writers of the Arabic language, from Khalil Gibran on. Khalil Gibran is the first person who starts the text, the collection, understood that the only way to formulate a distinct and firm Arab national identity was to do so by creating a firm Arabic language. And so the first thing that they did was to strip the Arabic language of its Ottoman influences, of its Persian influences. That was step one to creating Arab national identity. What we now know as the nation states of the Arab world were defined not by its politicians, not by its activists, but by its poets, but by its writers. This is certainly true of the Republic of Turkey at the end of the Ottoman Empire. Yes, it was military might that fended off the Europeans and allowed for the creation of the modern Turkish state. But it was the poets and writers, the Aziz Nesin or the Nazim Hikmets of Turkish literature, who in recreating the Turkish language, gave birth to the Turkish national identity. Same could be said certainly in Pakistan, same could certainly be said of modern Iran. It also, by the way, explains why those very same poets and writers whose words gave shape to the modern Middle East very quickly became the primary enemies of those states, because they turned their pens no longer against the Europeans, no longer against the colonialists, but against their own states. Poetry became very quickly the medium through which social criticism was formulated, particularly as the countries of the Middle East descended into despots and dictatorships. The fact of the matter is that in areas of the world in which the freedoms of speech and freedoms of the press are heavily curtailed, the poet becomes the journalist, the poet becomes the historian, the poet becomes the social critic. Poetry, literature itself becomes the mirror that's held up to society to show its failures. And so many of the poets and writers, those who even gave birth to these states, ended up in jail by these very states that they helped form. Many of them were tortured. A good number of them in the collection themselves were executed. What's really fascinating to me as a student of globalization, as an adherent, as an enthusiast of globalization, which I realize that in Europe and the UK is not a popular view right now, is that same sense of globalization in which our very worldview has shifted, in which the world has become an increasingly smaller space, has affected contemporary poetry and fiction literature in the Middle East. And so when you look at the latter parts of this collection, the stuff that sort of comes out in the 1980s and 90s and the 2000s, what you see is a rejection of the previous generation's focus, whether with national identity or with social criticism, and instead you have this inward-looking focus, this desire to look to the self as the source of understanding as opposed to looking to society. I say all this because what I want to emphasize is that you can understand the entire narrative arc of the Middle East for the last 100 years solely by reading its poetry, solely by reading its fiction. Indeed, that's the whole point of this book, is to tell the history of this region by using the words of its greatest writers. And so, in a sense, we come to the modern world in which, once again, this region is in the throes of radical transformation. And who is at the forefront of this? Once again, it's the poets and the writers, the young people in Iran, in Syria, in Egypt, who still understand that the most powerful medium to communicate these desires, these aspirations for freedom, for dignity, for hope, for a say in one's own future, can be best understood, can be best communicated through verse. And so that's what I want to talk about in our discussions, is the way in which the word, from pre-Islamic Arabia to 2011, has been the best way to understand this diverse, this eclectic region. Unfortunately, the opposite is what too often occurs. The primary lens through which most people in Europe and in North America understand or even recognize this region is through the lens of religion or politics. How do we know what the region is like? Because we listen to the media. But the media tells us what the leaders of the region think. And if there is one thing that everyone in this room should know by now, is the wide chasm of opinions and ideas, of aspirations that separate the leaders of the region from the people of the region. Those people have been voiceless for too long. They have not had an outlet to actually express their ideas and aspirations. They can't do so through the press, obviously. They can't do so through the institutions. And so they have to rely on the only means at their disposal, which is poetry, fiction. I'd like to end, if you don't mind, with one other poem, also by the great Egyptian poet Ahmed Fuad al-Nigm. I was going to read some Libyan poetry, but let's wait until Gaddafi joins bin Laden, which let's all hope will be very soon. This is a poem by Ahmed Fuad al-Nigm. Voiceless, quiet, voiceless, voiceless, tales behind that hush. So full of speech, yet I am dumb from mute surrounds. Mute, voiceless, quiet, mute, all words have died away. And walls of 1,000 houses swap shushed up words with me. Mute, voiceless, quiet, mute. But our silence is a sense more eloquent than words. And everyone who's heard us knows exactly what we say. He who brought us together must utter words today, must say, silence has died, must scream into the hush, mute, voiceless, quiet, mute. Let's all hope that the days in which the people of this region are voiceless and mute are behind us. Thank you very much. I believe that people are going to walk around with microphones. Usually at this time, somebody stands up and says that a question starts with a question word and ends with a question mark. I'm not interested. I mean, I'm certainly happy to answer your questions, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts. I mean, there's a reason why I'm at this institution. I think in the back. Yes. Just please wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for presenting with the flow. The power of words do mean a lot. Once someone asked the previous Chief Rabbi Yakovich as to what anti-Semitism was. Yakovich was a very bright poet, Chief Rabbi. He said, "Oh boy, you don't know. Anti-Semitism hating the Jew more than necessary." The word necessary is one word. It meant a lot. Why, sir? Seemingly everybody hates everyone else. Though your presentation was good, but it was not poetic, it was not lexical semantics. There is a political agenda beyond and behind. We live in a society, we carry baggages. So you have come with a message that you never mentioned about Gaddafi's grandchildren being killed. You can't wait until he is assassinated. Like Bin Laden was executed extrajudicially. Obama's assassin assassinated Osama. He was never tried. So you are going with a message. Like Francis Fukuyama came with End of History. The other one, Conflict of Civilizations. Could you divorce the Quran, religion, from CIA propaganda? Thank you.
No, I cannot do that at all. Nor am I interested in doing so. But I will say that I think one of the things that's really important to understand about jihadism as a movement, of which bin Laden was, a figure, an important figure for a while, but by no means its chief ideologue, is that it understands better than I can sort of explain to you the power of the word. Remember, one of the things that bin Laden enjoyed doing a lot, not just bin Laden, but Zawahiri, even Zarqawi, who was barely literate. I mean, he had the literary he had the education of a 5-year-old, and yet even he himself released repeatedly fatwa after fatwa after fatwa. Why? According to Islamic law, only a mufti who has spent decades in one of the handful of accepted schools of law has the right to issue a fatwa. The reason, of course, is because in doing so, what they are using is this traditional form of communication in order to take upon themselves the power, the authority that for 14 centuries has been solely in the hands of the institutions. It's a way of forming an institution in and of yourself. So really, I mean, that's, if you want to talk about why it was that jihadism was so successful, and I say was, because as an ideology, it is on its way into the trash bin of history. The reason it was so successful is because it understood that words have power, that the context of your words can actually can help you absorb power. Bin Laden was referred to as Sheikh bin Laden, which, again, according to Islamic law, doesn't make any sense. It's as though if, people started calling me Rabbi Aslan because I owned a Torah. This is a man who never spent a single day, not one day, in an Islamic seminary. He's a man who spent not a single day studying Islamic law. But he understood very, very well the power that words have to not just reshape societies, but to reflect that sort of personal power. That's a very important thing. That's part of, I think, where his success came from. There's a question up here.
Hello. Hi, Reza. I'm a student here at SOAS. I hope I can put out this this question. If it is, I will try and see how it goes. I followed your work a bit, and it's very inspiring. It's a good read, and tablet and pen. I'm waiting for a long weekend or something to get through it. But so you started off talking about the word in the Muslim world, and certainly your first book was The Origins and Evolution and Future of Islam. And now what you're doing is you're covering the breadth of the Muslim world, as far as I understand. And what makes it interesting is that you're drawing ideas from Egypt and you're relating it to what's happening in, for example, in Indonesia. You talk about this, and it's great to see someone doing this. But the question is, are you doing it within the banner of Islam? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? I'm saying
I do understand what you're
using Islam as an overarching umbrella to say the power of word has inspired people because these are nations in the Muslim world.
It's a very good question. Well, let me emphasize one thing, first of all, that this is not a collection of literature from the Muslim world. On the contrary, for a number of reasons. One, because there is no such thing as the Muslim world. And secondly, because that indicates that somehow these are Muslim writings, and they are not. There are Christians and Jews in this collection. This is a writing of literature from the Middle East. Now, before you start telling me that Turkey doesn't belong in the Middle East and that South Asia does not belong in the Middle East, let me clarify something. There is no such thing as the Middle East. The Middle East is a completely fabricated construct. It is a term that was never meant to be read as a geographic designation when the British first coined it in order to talk about the land between the Occident and the Far East. Land that whose principal purpose was to be divvied up and used for its resources. The Middle East is not a geographic designation, it's a civilizational designation. It's a cultural designation. It's a moral designation, if I could channel Edward Said for a moment. So rather than fight that designation, rather than argue that there is nothing about Morocco that is, Moroccans have nothing in common with Syrians, and they do not. They certainly don't have language in common, and if you can find a Syrian who can understand a Moroccan, I'll give you $1. What do the Syrians have in common with Iran? Nothing. What do Iranians have in common with Lebanese? Nothing. Not religion, not culture, not ethnicity, not language. So the very idea of labeling this region with this term, the Middle East, is a deliberate attempt to create some kind of oppositional ideal. That which is not the Occident. That was the purpose of the term, the Orient. That which is not the Occident. That which is not us. And that term is still very much alive today. The Middle East is a wastebasket term that we use to say, not us. My point is good. And I wanted to absorb that definition of the Middle East and all of its, connotations to say, okay, so the West thinks of this region as a single place, even though it has almost nothing in common. I will give you the literature of this region, because if there is one thing that this incredibly mosaic part of the world does have in common, is a common historical consciousness. One born from the experience of European colonialism, the experience of Western imperialism and Western cultural hegemony. One born from the common experience of having to fashion a national identity, an idea that was invented by Europe and exported into this region, a region that didn't really have a conception of secular nationalism in the way that we understand it. To have to sort of come up with that, in the 20th century as a result of the twilight of the colonial period. And one born, of course, with the struggles of having to figure out a way to create a common national identity out of the various ethnic and religious and cultural and linguistic traditions that were put together and carved by these fabricated nationalities, these totally false and random borders created by Europeans in order to more easily divvy up this land. That is a tradition that is reflected in the literature of this region. So the only thing that they have in common, honestly, is that literary tradition. And so, in a sense, I deliberately wanted to use that construct, to flip that convention on its head by talking about that one idea, that one common shared heritage, the sole common shared heritage in this diverse region. But by no means is this Muslim writing. Most of the writers in here, if they were pressed, would probably call themselves atheists. The best writers in here are mostly communists, including the man whose poem, Tablet and Pen, Fez Ahmed Fez, gives the book its title, a Marxist and communist. So, and yes, of course, there are some Muslims in here, though I sincerely doubt that they would define themselves as Muslim writers. I mean, no more than Philip Roth would call himself a Jewish writer. Other people call Philip Roth a Jewish writer. Philip Roth does not call himself a Jewish writer. He happens to be Jewish, and he's a writer. But at the same time, let's be honest, this is a region in which Islam, as an identity, not as a religion, in which Islam is ever present. It infuses itself into the culture. It infuses itself into the practices, the customs, the very national identity, even for these quote-unquote secular states, is still very much founded upon Islam, very much in the same way that the national identity of my home country, the United States, though it calls itself, a secular country, is deeply rooted in Protestantism. Deeply rooted in Protestantism. So, obviously, religion has a role. It has an influence. It affects the identity of these writers, and it affects the writings that we have here. But no, this is not a writing from the Muslim world. This is not Muslim writings by any means at all. There was a question in that. I'm sorry. What was the last part of that?
No, it's answered pretty well.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming.
Maybe you agree or you may not. If football could be a religion, what do you think? Can't the religion, the art of resistance and resistance through struggle, whether portrayed through words or poetic genius, indigenously, or as you say, in globalized version. In fact, that is the religion which is cementing and which is surmounting all borders. That is what is bothering Obama, for what he came and he said, well, this is the time to lead, and we are the catalyst of change, catalyst of bringing civilizational norms or all those things he was saying. But the thing is this, basically, for example, you take Pakistan, India. Faiz Ahmad Faiz, he was awarded Lenin Prize. Lenin, the name of Lenin was not a name, a congenial name, a welcome name for the clergy. They thought he's an atheist. But at the national poet of Pakistan, Allama Iqbal, when he presents Lenin before Almighty Allah, God. And God questions him that, after all, what prompted you to bring such a sharp, incisive revolution in Russia? And then he says that you don't know. He says that बहुत तलख है बंदा है मजदूर के औकात. तू कादर व आदल है मगर तेरे जहां में बहुत तलख है बंदा है मजदूर के औकात. That okay, you are great or whatever, sovereignty or your your omnipresent omnipotence. But the working classes are really dripping blood, you know. They are being exploited. So then being enthused, even God Almighty is impressed. And then he commands his angels, including Archangel and the Holy Ghost. And he says that go, reach the farthest corners of the earth and bring revolution. And he says that go, arise, the oppressed of and the weaklings of the earth, and demolish these so-called grandeur preaching but dirty looking palaces. So that poetry in India or Pakistan or in Africa, for example, when a Petrus Lumumba is assassinated, a poet writes from Pakistan, from India, that assassination is mourned. For example, they say, well, we have finished the business with the watery grave of Osama bin Laden. Oh no, it's not a question of fundamentalism. The thing is this, you are contradicting your own history. When Hitler, we don't go into the figures, 6 million or 7 million or 4 million, because that will become another debate. But for his accomplices, you set up a tribunal. I've forgotten the name of the place where the trials were held. Tojo of Japan, then they were hanged, you know. The thing is this is not a good policy, that you give a bad name to a person and then you just kill him without a trial.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you.
See,
I have to interrupt you. I have to, no, I have to interrupt you. I'm interrupting you. I'm interrupting you. Let me emphasize this so that this question doesn't come up again. I could not give a damn about the issue of bin Laden's death. So stop asking me about it. I'm glad that he's dead. I hope he's fish food right now. And I don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm here to talk about literature. I'm here to talk about poetry. As far as I'm concerned, he should have been dead a long time ago. Thank you very much. That's what I have to say about Osama bin Laden. Next question, please. Next question, please.
Poetry of resistance is the real poetry.
Do I have to physically have you removed? Because I will. If you have a question about literature, I would like to talk about it.
I wanted to talk about...
I will physically have you removed if you do not stop talking. We'll take care of it right now.
Gentlemen, let's have some discipline.
Osama was executed by Obama.
If I had the gun, I would have shot him myself in the eye. That's right. I would have done it myself. Yes, sir.
Reza, don't invite your friends again.
I wanted to pick up on this notion you pointed out with the later writers in the 1990s and in the 2000s. You talked about an introspection and a concern with the self.
Yeah.
Carl Jung, in the 1950s, noticed something about Christianity. He said, the Christian tradition is failing Christians. They now have to find a personal myth that will be found internally and introspectively in themselves. This does not mean they are not Christian. This means that they are Christian in their own particular way, in their own particular nation, in their own particular style. I wonder, leaving aside the question as you put, it's the Middle East, it's similar to the issue of Central Europe, the whole issue of Central Europea, that was pre-existent of this idea of the Middle East. I wonder if we can now say, for Muslims, there is a way to find it personally, which is not within the nation state and not within the traditions as they were formerly experienced in an earlier generational time.
Yeah, this is actually a very, very good question. Very smart observation, because what it does is it indicates this movement. I talk a little bit about this in my first book, that I've referred to as the Reformation of Islam. The better way to term it is the individualization of Islam. This conflict that I was talking about nationalism, the creation of a national identity, one can say that it was a failed, that it didn't actually work. That the idea of defining yourself, first and foremost, not along ethnic or religious or tribal lines, and instead defining yourself according to your nation state, according to the borders around your community. Borders, by the way, that for the most part you had nothing to do in fashioning, was a wholly foreign concept for many people of this region. It's why we have, these great conflicts. It was interesting to me that there was all this sort of consternation about post-invasion Iraq and the civil war that took place and the idea of forming a national identity. And when the truth is that this is a fake country created, with totally arbitrary borders by outsiders who had no interest in the ethnic or cultural makeup inside the country itself. One could go so far, by the way, as to say secular nationalism has failed everywhere, including in Europe, which of course is on the precipice of becoming a transnational identity, an identity in which your status as a nation state is increasingly taking a back seat to the transnational status as European. And of course, there's a lot of backlash against that. I understand that. But I do think that what's really fascinating about the Middle East is that an idea that was never all that strongly absorbed to begin with is now fading away as a result of globalization and as a result of the same globalizing forces that are prevalent everywhere else in the world. With the possible exception of my country, the United States, where we've kind of are unaware of the fact that the rest of the world is losing its borders. We're actually strengthening our borders. But in the Middle East in particular, I mentioned this a little bit in my discussion last night, something quite profound is starting to happen. And it's too new for me to analyze it in any kind of professional or academic way. I'm just sort of really reporting my observation. Is that a transnational identity is starting to form again. Not pan-Arabism, that's not what I'm referring to here. That has been more or less understood as a failed ideology. But I'm talking about something that's more inclusive of the broader Middle East, a bit of what I was referring to earlier. This notion really, I think, helped by the so-called Arab Spring, the revolutions that we're seeing across the region. That there is something unique to this region. There is something that the region does have in common with each other. That there is a communion that goes beyond the national borders, indeed goes beyond ethnic identities, that goes beyond religious identities. One of the things that a lot of people did not notice, by the way, on that final day in Tahrir Square, when Hosni Mubarak ostensibly stepped down, when he went to his palace at Sharm el-Sheikh, is there was this dramatic moment that Iranians like myself paid a lot of attention to, but nobody else did, wherein a group of students unfurled a banner in the middle of Tahrir Square thanking the Green Movement in Iran, the 2009 Green Movement,